Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Icarus, and today we are doing something I didn't think I would do. We are going to read The Whipping Girl. I have divided the book into about 7 parts, partially to try and keep my videos a little shorter. If I did everything all at once, it'd probably be 2 hours long. Also, this is something for my own sanity because I want to make sure I'm carefully reading this, giving it as unbiased a look as I possibly can, that sort of thing. I will admit, going into this book, I am a little bit biased. I've had battles and quote unquote TME people bringing this book up as a sort of cudgel when we try to talk about trans mask issues, be it from trying to use transmisogyny as it was written down to talk about the specific intersection of transphobia and misogyny, or by trying to coin our own words to be able to discuss our own unique struggles. People like to use The Whipping Girl as a way to attempt and silence us because it's been such a popular and foundational book. So, what is The Whipping Girl? It is a book that was published in 2007 by Julia Serrano. Julia Serrano was born in the 1960s and has since become a very well-known trans activist, as well as being an out and proud transsexual woman. She is still alive to this day, and she's actually recently commented on Twitter about the TME TMA debacle, where she is very for TME TMA discussions and has put down people who are critiquing that as a new binary. So the book was actually written in 2005, so we need to be aware going into this that it was a very different time. We're in the year of this fiery pit of hell, 2022. So this is over 15 years ago at this point. Therefore, some of the language isn't perfect by today's standards, and we just need to be aware. There's been changes. There's been differences in how people are treated coming out. We are looking at this story from the year 2022, and we need to be aware that that is a bias, as well as the fact that I'm coming at this as a trans man who wants to see how Julia Serrano talks about trans misogyny and talks about other people in the trans umbrella, in addition to how she talks about trans women and trans women's struggles. So, with that little disclaimer out of the way, I am going to start. And what I've done is I've gone through and highlighted things in the first couple of sections, and I'm going to read my ending thought notes of each section before I go through it and read you highlighted portions, as well as continue to expound upon my thoughts. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully it's an enjoyable listen, and without further ado, let's get started. So we start with the introduction. It's basically Serrano explaining why she's chosen to write this book, as well as explaining that when she mentioned she wanted to write something, she had different expectations. Anything from a gory autobiography talking about her own transition to a general trans activist screed. She didn't want to do either of those. She wanted to talk about specifically trans women's issues and how womanhood and being transgender intersect in a way that creates trans misogyny. This is the book that coined the term. So, when I looked at the introduction, I realized Serrano is coming from an inherently different place when we're talking about gender and being, and how, in my opinion, even if you're a binary trans person, you are still bypassing gender norms, whereas she does not seem to think about it in the same way, at least for the female to male equivalent. I also ended up writing, I'm curious if she speaks it about how trans always comes before women in discussions about trans women, and if she shows in her book how she came to her conclusion that trans women are hurt first and foremost for their womanhood and not for being trans. I am also curious about placing femininity first in this book and the lack of attention to how gender nonconforming cis women are treated. Will this come up? Let's find out. So, a big thing about those notes, and we'll get into a little bit more when I'm reading my selected quotes, is the fact that she's talking about, in order to truly create an equality and a patriarchal society, you need to put femininity first and stop treating it like it's fragile and broken, etc., etc., which is a pretty common feminist talking point, but it feels weird with some of the stuff that I've later read her talking about trans men. So, starting with the quote, while I do believe that all transgender people have a stake in the same political fight against those who fear and dismiss gender diversity and difference in all its wondrous forms, I do not believe that we are discriminated against in the same ways and for the same exact reasons. And this is basically her talking about how some people thought she was going to write a transgender revolution book, and talking about how everyone is a victim of the same rigid gender norms. And I ended up writing as a note, this feels especially important to highlight as Beatles and trans people fighting against the idea of a term specific towards trans mass struggles and try to hide behind this book as evidence. So I started reading this and was like, oh, cool. Already have a quote to use against people who are arguing against the idea that trans men don't have specific issues. I was very hopeful. She then goes on and talks about how people would treat her differently according to her gender identity and expression. And then she talks about the focus on transgender as a one-size-fits-all category for those who transgress binary gender norms has inadvertently erased the struggles faced by those of us who lie at the intersection of multiple forms of gender-based prejudice. And while I agree and I disagree with this, I do think it's very easy to try and sweep all the unique forms of transphobia under the same rug. We are currently having that issue where people are trying to sweep transandrophobia under the transphobia rug and saying it's not as bad as what trans women face. I also disagree because I am a bit of an old fart and I do kind of miss the days when we didn't have 1,000 different types of micro labels. I really like how in history lesbian and homosexuality sort of encompassed a lot of things, anything from bisexual people to some gender non-conforming people who might have been trans to asexual people, that sort of thing. While I recognize that it is very nice and very good and helpful to have more distinct labels, and micro labels can help create a sense of community for very specific needs, I think it's still important to have these umbrella terms, and I think it's important that we recognize that not everyone wants to be so pinpointed. And I don't really like the way that Julia Serrano ends up talking about transgender umbrella terms going forward. So then I end up highlighting an entire paragraph. The idea that all anti-trans discrimination arises from the fact that, as transgender people, we transgress binary gender norms does not resonate completely with my personal experience. As a somewhat eccentric kid, I was given plenty of leeway to opt out of boys' activities and to cultivate an androgynous appearance and persona. I was sometimes teased for being different, for being an atypical or unmasculine boy, but it was nothing compared to venom that was reserved for those boys who acted downright feminine. And now, as an out transsexual woman, I find that those who wish to ridicule or dismiss me do not simply take me to task for the fact that I failed to conform to gender norms. Instead, more often than not, they mock my femininity. From the perspective of an occasional gender bender or someone on the female to male spectrum, it might seem like the binary gender norms are at the core of all anti-trans discrimination, but most of the anti-trans sentiment that I have had to deal with as a transsexual woman is probably better described as misogyny. And that's where, in my sort of summary thoughts, I was like, I don't think she and I agree fundamentally about what's going on when someone is mocking her when she was a sort of feminine boy to a transsexual woman, because it's very dismissive, again, of gender nonconforming and transmasculine people. But I'll read you my actual notes from when I initially read this. It may be all well and good that it doesn't seem to mesh with Serrano's interpretation of her experiences, but when I read her words, it still comes across as people mocking her for transgressing binary gender norms. A huge part of misogyny is rooted in the idea that women should act in a certain way, and when they don't, they should be mocked and ridiculed, beaten and forced back into their assigned role. When people see Serrano, they're still seeing a woman who may not be deemed the ideal feminine woman. Since she's such a public figure, her harassment stems from the fact they still see her as trans before they see her as a woman. The adjective is cleaved to her because of her activism, and it's impossible to tell how people will react to her if she was firmly stealth. It also feels odd to highlight trans men disagreeing with her so early on. Is this an early example of the idea that trans men and masked people are exempt from the effects of misogyny? So I still agree with what I wrote there because I think that the level of teasing that she got as a child is directly entwined with the fact that she was shirking masculine models. And even though she wasn't as girly as the more feminine men, therefore she wasn't targeted as much when people thought that she was just a slightly atypical boy. And now that she's out as a trans activist, she's not someone who can easily go into stealth. So the harassment she gets, it's hard to tell if it's because she's a trans woman, if because she's a woman, or what, because we can't uncleave the fact that she is a trans activist from her identity. This is something that she did to herself. And honestly, I would rather hear the experiences of 100 regular trans people than one trans activist woman, because she's out there and the harassment she receives is because of her identity, not just because she is a woman. It's because of her activism. I hope that makes sense. Then we're going on down. The idea that this book is to debunk many of the myths and misconceptions people have about transsexual women as well as gender, and trying to explore the different facets that they have to dehumanize trans women, and talking about how trans women aren't ridiculed because they're transgressing gender binary norms, but because they choose to be women rather than men, which I added a note of. It's still a transgression of gender binary. There's also the mention of the fact that we identify and live as women despite being born male and having inherited male privilege. And I'm just like, oh, this really did come out in 2007, because now the current argument that we see a lot of times is trans women never had male privilege because they were never men. So this came out in 2007 for sure. The idea, while it's considered offensive or prejudiced to openly discriminate against someone for being female, discriminating against someone's femininity is still fair game. I agree with, to an extent, that someone's femininity can be critiqued. I actually see this when we're talking about gender nonconforming women and cis women. I actually see this critique of femininity coming more from other women. And I have also noticed that there is a lot of anger and violence towards gender nonconforming women who may be butch or he/him lesbians or whatever. This is he/him lesbians not being trans women who are not out, by the way. There are lesbians who prefer to go by he/him pronouns for one reason or another. There are women who prefer to go by he/him pronouns. So I do agree with this, but I don't think it stems quite from the same thing that she's thinking about. And I find this critique of attacking femininity interesting when we get into some of her thoughts about movies like Transamerica. In a world where femininity is so regularly dismissed, perhaps no form of gendered expression is considered more artificial and more suspect than male and transgender expressions of femininity. I do agree with this because I do see how effeminate men are treated and are hurt for trying to express things that are typically considered feminine, like emotions. So I can't really argue with that. And moving on down, we talk about feminism, queer theory, dismissing femininity by characterizing it as performance. And she says, instead, I argue that certain aspects of femininity as well as masculinity are natural and can both precede socialization and supersede biological sex. For these reasons, I believe it is negligent for feminists to focus only on those who are female-bodied, or for transgender activists to only talk about binary gender norms. Again, we're kind of hitting on this trans mask experience too, and it feels weird, especially coming from a place where post JKR and her manifesto and talking about how it's not right for reproductive rights to be gender neutral. It just hits weird in this day and age, doesn't it? There's a talk about forcing transsexuals to describe themselves in non-trans terminology and valuables, which place us in a subordinate position. So, it's something I agree with. This is a topic that's been had in asexual circles as well, where ace people were trying to come up with an alternate word for people who experience sexual attraction or people who experienced romantic attraction, and we ended up on allosexual and alloromantic. They're not perfect fits, but they work for the point so that we aren't kind of othering ourselves in discussions. I make the case that feminist activism in theory would best be served by working to empower and embrace femininity rather than eschewing or deriding it as it often has in the past. I don't disagree, but I'm also curious about how I feel like this may be one of the sentences, one of the sentiments in this book that have Beatles and lesbian separatists and that sort of thing have kind of latched onto, because a lot of it is celebrating femininity and the different forms that it can present, and openly deriding masculinity, calling it toxic, that sort of thing. So from there, that was the end of my notes for the introduction. We go to the Trans Woman Manifesto. And apparently this was posted, it may still be posted on her website, but it's also in the book. And once again, I'm going to scroll to where I put my ending notes. There is a lot of notes. There we go. So it's weird to be reading something that came out in 2007 in today's political climate, especially when I start applying it to online spaces like Reddit and Tumblr. And as mind you, 2007, the internet, YouTube was a completely different beast at the time. Because it's so easy to see where the arguments I've seen are coming from now, it's especially easy to see when they fucking reference this book every 2 seconds. But also just generally, it's like a peek into a different world. Times have changed, and of course bringing this book into online discourse isn't going to be an exact science. But there's a lot more open anger towards masculinity now. There's also a lot of dismissal of trans men experiences. I would expect them to be glossed over in a book whose focus is female issues, but it almost feels derogatory and resentful. Again, coming from the perspective of having this book used to belittle my identity and the experiences thereof, maybe the hostility isn't intended, but it's what I see. Again, I am recognizing my bias. I want y'all to be aware that that's where I'm coming from. I'm trying to read this in good faith, but sometimes it's hard. So we are now scrolling back up to the top to my favorite line. Perhaps no sexual minority is more maligned or misunderstood than trans women. There we have it. There is the source of the oppression Olympics, where trans women have it worse than men. And I almost stopped reading at this point, but I decided to keep going because I've wanted to try and give this book, because it's so fundamental to modern understandings of trans misogyny. Trans women are so ridiculed and despised because we are uniquely positioned at the intersection of multiple binary gender-based forms of prejudice, transphobia, cis-sexism, and misogyny. Clearly, I would argue that trans men / masked people, this is me, as well as anyone who is AFAB, can be seen at this intersection as well. While the brought up term transmisogyny isn't a perfect fit for the unique struggles trans masked people face, plenty of trans men have grown up dealing with misogyny and still have to deal with it when they transition in a variety of ways. Moving on to the next paragraph, in much the same way that homophobic people are often driven by their own repressed homosexual tendencies, Transphobia is first and foremost an expression of one's own insecurity about having to live up to cultural gender ideals. And I cackled, mostly on the inside when I read this, because I thought we had, I thought in 2007 we had moved past the idea that homophobia is rooted in someone's inherent homosexuality, that secretly all the men who hate gays are gay themselves in some way. But no, it's in this book. It's in this book and is being applied to the idea that transphobia comes from one's own discomfort of living up to cultural gender norms. No, some people just hate us. And there's a great big paragraph that I ended up making a note that it feels outdated. While all transgender people experience transphobia, transsexuals additionally experience a related, albeit distinct, form of prejudice, cis-sexism, which is the belief that transsexuals' identified genders are inferior to or less authentic than those of cis-sexuals, i.e. people who are not transsexual and who have only ever experienced their subconscious and physical sexes as being aligned. The most common expression of cis-sexism occurs when people attempt to deny the transsexual the basic privileges that are associated with the trans person's self-identified gender. Common examples include purposeful misuse of pronouns or insisting that the trans person use a different public restroom. The justification for this denial is generally founded on the assumption that the trans person's gender is not authentic because it does not correlate with the sex they were assigned at birth. In making this assumption, cis-sexists attempt to create an artificial hierarchy. By insisting that the trans person's gender is fake, they attempt to validate their own gender as real or natural. This sort of thinking is extraordinarily naive as it denies a basic truth. We make assumptions every day about other people's genders without ever seeing their birth certificates, their chromosomes, their genitals, their reproductive systems, their childhood socialization, or their legal sex. There is no such thing as a real gender. There is only the gender we experience ourselves and the gender we perceive others to be. So, when I say this is outdated, I don't mean in the fact that everything in that isn't true. I'm saying it's outdated in the fact that Serrano is drawing a line between what she describes as transsexual people and other people under the trans umbrella. Every trans person I know have had this issue. Gender nonconforming cis people have also had this issue of being ridiculed, denied, sometimes beaten for such experiences as trying to use the other bathroom. So it feels closed-minded, and that becomes ironic a little bit later. You'll see. Just a note about her talking about how rigid gender roles hurt people, especially trans women, but I mentioned that they also hurt cis people as well. Like, that's the entire point of feminism, isn't it? Talking about how trans women are inherently mocked by society because they choose to embrace their own femininity, and I still argue the fact that conventional conservative sources of media and news do mock trans women for that, but it's also because they're an easy fearmonger. It's hard to be scared of a trans man when you believe that the trans man is actually a woman, but it's so much easier to be scared of a trans woman when you believe the trans woman is actually a man, but it's also easy to mock them because they are a man in a dress, so to speak. And again, that's mostly from my experience with talking to conservative people, as well as seeing the media that I used to consume as a kid. Actually, in this time, because 2007, I was in 9th grade, and I was heavy in the Fox News trying to become a politically savvy conservative 14-year-old. Then there was another thing I highlighted. While trans people on the female to male spectrum face discrimination for breaking gender norms, i.e. oppositional sexism, their expressions of maleness or masculinity themselves are not targeted for ridicule. To do so would require one to question masculinity itself. And I wrote, big oof. Again, I'm starting to see where Elliot, who I didn't name before, but Elliot is the person who I reacted to, who was talking about transgenderphobia not being a thing, as well as basically trans men need to shut up, is coming from in their attempts to dissect trans masc experiences. The fact they spoke so highly of Whipping Girl and this in its opening pages is something worth notice. trans men's expressions are absolutely ridiculed and mocked, and quite hard, both within and without the queer community. For a very good example, we can look at how cis gay men oftentimes treat trans men, be they bisexual or straight. It's it's disingenuous to say that trans mass expressions of masculinity aren't mocked. And I realize that this is coming from a trans woman, so I don't expect her to understand everything. But if you don't understand trans mass experiences, don't write this sort of shit in your book, essentially. There is when women's or lesbian organizations and events open their doors to trans men but not trans women, that is not transphobia, it is trans misogyny. And also, the Trans Woman Manifesto is where the trans misogyny term first comes up. So it's right there in the beginning, before even chapter 1. And I wrote the huge thing that basically it's like, it is transphobia. It's not just trans misogyny, because there is a hint of transandrophobia for assuming that trans men want to be in those spaces. But there's also some women's only spaces, like when we're talking about reproductive health care, where trans men do fit and trans women not so much. Not saying stuff like trans women don't need to go see an OBGYN if they've had bottom surgery. I'm talking about like fertility, you can get ovarian cancer, that sort of thing. There are parts that a trans man has that a trans woman does not, that cis women have, generally. I'm not trying to say every woman has these parts everywhere. I'm not bioessentialist. There are some spaces where trans men should be in, and sometimes trans men still identify with the lesbian community, but it is still very transphobic for lesbians generally to allow trans men in who may not identify as a lesbian, as well as to force out trans women who want to be in those spaces because they are lesbians. So it is transphobia. It's also trans misogyny, and it can be transandrophobia, but it is transphobia. There is no greater perceived threat than the existence of trans women who, despite being born male and inheriting male privilege, choose to be female instead. Here it is again, the Oppression Olympics. And then she makes a couple of points about traditional sexism, dismissing them. The media hyper-feminizes us by accompanying stories about trans women with the pictures of us putting on makeup, dresses, and high-heeled shoes in an attempt to highlight the supposed frivolous nature of our femaleness, or by portraying trans women as having derogatory feminine associate character traits such as being weak, confused, passive, or mousy. And I wrote that I very much disagree here. Even woke media hyper-feminizes trans women because trans women are our current role models, and they're our current gender spokespeople. It's an issue of hypervisibility, but there's also just, I don't think people are willing to put butch trans women in front of cameras, be it in fictional media or news stories or anything like that, because people who don't understand transness in general will see that as proof that they're not actually trans. And people who are just now understanding transness and are trying to accept it, I can see their heads blowing up. And it's not a good thing. I wish that media would be more daring and start normalizing gender nonconforming trans women as well as putting trans men out there. But it's as much a problem on feminist side as it is on conservative side, and I don't think that it is hyper feminizing either, not necessarily meant to be a bad thing. That got away from me a little bit. I should read my notes next time. We must also challenge the idea that femininity is inferior to masculinity and that femaleness is inferior to maleness. I do agree with this, but I also believe that a lot of feminism has overcorrected and started pushing masculinity and maleness down as being inferior to femininity. And again, we see that a lot with beta L culture, lesbian separatists. Like, lesbian separatists were starting to be a thing when she was born, so this isn't something that she should be unfamiliar with. There is another thing talking about how self-described feminists have gone out of their way to dismiss trans people, and they regularly use the same thing that media uses against trans women, and it highlighted these pseudo-feminists proclaim women can do anything men can, then ridicule trans women for any perceived masculine tendency we may have. And I disagree with the pseudo-feminist. It's a radfem theology. And I have a link that I'm going to open because it was important. Okay, so the second wave of feminism, which was in the 60s and 70s, so right when she was born and a little kid. I'll link this in the description as well. It talks about the different types of feminism that came out of this because there was no way to create a coherent train of thought. And my favorite part that I'm going to highlight is, in contrast to the pragmatic approach taken by liberal feminism, radical feminism aimed to reshape society and restructure its institutions, which they saw as inherently patriarchal. Providing the core theory for modern feminism, radicals argued that women's subservient role in society was too closely woven into the social fabric to be unraveled without a revolutionary revamping of society itself. They strove to supplant hierarchical and traditional power relationships they saw as reflecting a male bias, and they sought to develop non-hierarchical and anti-authoritarian approaches to politics and organization. And there was like three main trains of thought, but I thought that was important to highlight that radical feminism has its roots in the second wave of feminism, and it's kind of escalated since the 60s and 70s. And they're not pseudo-feminists because they are radfems. This is a line of thought from feminism that has only grown, and I think it is disingenuous to call them pseudo-feminists. It is no longer enough for feminism to fight slowly for the rights of those born female. Though not everyone born female is having their rights defended. We must challenge all who assume that feminine vulnerability is a sign of weakness, for when we do open ourselves up, whether it be by honestly communicating our thoughts and feelings or expressing our emotions, it is a daring act, one that takes more courage and inner strength than the alpha male facade of silence and stoicism. I feel gross reading that particular line because it's like, I hate that Serrano is conflating vulnerability and emotional honesty with the feminine. I thought the idea was to break down gender roles and let men be able to express their emotions without... I realize we are touching on the idea of fragile masculinity here, but it's weird to be reading this and feeling like men are once again being pushed down. It reads a bit radfemmy to me. In a world where masculinity is assumed to represent strength and power, those who are butch and boyish are able to contemplate their identities within the relative safety of those connotations. And I, once again, am bothered by this because butch and boyish gender nonconforming women, and I mean, she even mentions butch and boyish trans women, they are oftentimes forced to perform femininity for other people. They don't necessarily want to do it, but they're forced and they're harassed and sometimes manipulated into doing so. It's not safe for either side of the coin. And again, there's the idea of it takes guts and courage for the feminine to rise up and do their thing. And I, once again, am just like, you have been berating hyper-feminine representations of trans women, and putting down and saying that butch women are underrepresented, but you're still talking about how the hyperfem is more maligned. When we buy into the idea that female and male are opposites, it becomes impossible for us to empower women without either ridiculing men or pulling the rug out from under ourselves. And look what's happened to this book. It's being used against trans men to say that we're less oppressed. Okay, so we just finished just the introduction in the Trans Woman Manifesto, and looking at the time, it's taken about 30 minutes to record this, and I'm realizing now that it was very hopeful of me to be able to take those two parts as well as the first two chapters and make a complete video that would be under an hour. So I'm going to end it here actually and get into chapter 1 and hopefully chapter 2 or tomorrow, depending on how I feel. But I once again need to highlight the fact that Serrano is kind of pushing for two different modes of thought. And on the one hand, she is talking about how trans women are oftentimes hyper-feminized in media, and butch trans women and tomboyish trans women are underlooked and ignored. But she is also talking about how butch and boyish facing people, presenting people, are relatively safe compared to the femme representation, and also completely dismissing trans men, openly saying that trans women are the most oppressed class. And is it really a surprise that the Bedels and everyone else who loves to use this book against us are saying that trans women are the most oppressed class and trying to make it so trans men can't talk about their shit? Again, this book is from 2007. I imagine it did a lot of good in the time. It coined a term that's very important to discussing specific trans issues. But going into this, I don't have high hopes of her not maligning masculinity when she feels like it's okay to do so, despite her own words of saying we shouldn't do so. But alright, that's going to be it for me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, I guess. And I will talk to y'all tomorrow. Bye.